My name is Zoltan Pieter, and I will moderate this panel. I'm the head of the Impact Assessment Unit in DG EPRS. So in the second roundtable of the conference, we will continue the foresight aspect from the first session with our esteemed speaker discussing, among others, if and how foresight and other innovative tools such as stress testing are applied in impact assessments. In a study prepared by Gaia Tafoni and Claudio Radaelli, who will, by the way, speak tomorrow at this conference, I read an interesting statement, which was something like, "It is obvious that foresight and impact assessment are not enemies, but friends, but it is less obvious to define how they can be friends." So this sentence is going around in circle in my head, so I hope we find a solution to this at this session today. Now let me briefly introduce the speakers of this session, and then I will say a few words about the proceedings. So our first speaker, Ms. Elisabetta SIRACUSA, is a member of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board of the European Commission since December 2022. Previously, she worked in different and important functions in the Commission in the fields of finance, agriculture and trade. The second intervention will be shared between my colleagues Suzana ANGHEL and Irmi ANGLMAYER. Suzana works as a policy analyst in the Policy Foresight Unit in DG EPRS, where her research focuses on foreign and security policy with a foresight component. Irmi is a policy analyst in the Ex-Ante Impact Assessment Unit, and she has a long track record of policy evaluation, and I can tell you that she's a real specialist in better regulation. Our fourth speaker, Tine ANDERSEN, has been a senior specialist at the Danish Technological Institute since 2005, and her main research interest is European policies and instruments and their implementation at national, regional and local level. She has also contributed to the development of a European approach to stress testing European policies in cooperation with DG EPRS. And the concluding intervention will be made by Mr. Pieter Caboor, who is a parliamentary lawyer and the director of the legal affairs of the Parliamentary Documentation and the Parliamentary Documentation Department of the Belgian House of Representatives. Mr. Caboor is also the author of several academic publications in the field of parliamentary practice and procedure, and he regularly lectures on these topics. So just as the previous part of the conference, this session will also be web streamed and recorded and published afterwards. As for the timing, I kindly ask our speakers to keep their intervention to a maximum of 15 minutes in order to save time for some discussion amongst us and also to take questions from the audience, from the room and also from online. I thank in advance to Virginia for helping me on that with the online audience. So without stretching the introduction any further, I hand the floor over to our first speaker, Elisabetta SIRACUSA, to set the scene. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoltan, and thank you for setting up such an interesting and important topic for this conference. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted perhaps to introduce a little bit the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. I imagine that some of you have heard of us and some of you have perhaps read some of our work, but I think it's always a good idea to introduce the work that we do because it's not necessarily well known. It's part of a machine that delivers better regulation through a number of steps, and we are in the parts, in those parts of the step that are firmly embedded in the Commission. What are we? We have been set up as part of the renewed better regulation agenda of the European Commission. And within the European Commission, we are an independent quality assessment body. We do not, we work independently, we do not seek nor take instructions, and we deliver a quality assessment for impact assessments for evaluations and for fitness checks. These come to us, I want to stress, at an early stage of the decision-making process. They come to us before any decision-making on the part of the college, and of course, before any decision-making on the part of the co-legislators. So this is the work that we do, and of course, our work is based on a number of better regulations principles and tools, which I invite you to look at, even though I think they amount to about 500 pages, but voila, it's perhaps worth looking at. And as I indicated, we issue opinions, and these opinions can be negative or positive, or sometimes we have positive opinions, but with reservations that need to be addressed. And these opinions are then published when an initiative is adopted by the College of Commissioners. I want to stress that the role of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board is not to judge neither the appropriateness nor any political dimension of any initiative. It is only to judge the quality of draft impact assessments, in particular the quality of the analysis. And there are many parameters and many aspects to the impact assessment analysis, as one of them is foresight. And I'll come to that in a moment, of course, in order to provide a little bit, perhaps, of input into our discussion about foresight. Just one word about two limitations that I have. I will not be able to discuss specific cases, but luckily we have an excellent briefing provided by the Parliamentary Research Services, which has case studies, but I won't be able to address any because it's the policy of the board, of course, never to discuss any specific cases. And the second limitation I have some numbers I can give you, but they refer to 2022, because we are currently working on our annual report for 2023, which will be presented in a conference on the 22nd of May. And in fact, it might be a conference of interest to people in this room, and of course, you will be very welcomed, and all the information will be, of course, on our website. And there we will present our annual report, which contains statistics on various parameters, including foresight. So let's perhaps try, I will try perhaps to illustrate very, very briefly how foresight is used as a tool in the toolbox for better regulation. For impact assessments, because this is the subject of this afternoon, but of course it is also used for evaluations, which I understand you will touch upon tomorrow. So it's considered one of the key dimensions of better regulation, and all the more so since 2021, where the Commission, in fact, in its better regulation communication, emphasized how foresight should be a parameter that should be checked for every impact assessment, and this is what we do. So at what points of impact assessment does foresight come into play? Well, from the very beginning. It comes into play at the very first step, which is the problem definition. So already when we look at the problem definition, foresight is included and is expected to be used. And it's expected to be used for the definition of the problem itself, but also for the definition of the drivers of the problem. The drivers are a very important part of the problem definition because the drivers allow also the dimension of time, other dynamic dimensions to be integrated and to be analyzed with greater granularity. So that's the second aspect in which the foresight comes into play in problem definition. The third aspect is the analysis of the likelihood for the problem to persist. This also includes, as you can imagine, a measure of foresight. So you can see all these three dimensions of the problem, which is the first step. We always start from the problem, the definition, the drivers, and the likelihood that will persist, all imply a measure of foresight, and all imply the use of this tool. Then the next step in the assessment of impacts is the definition of objectives of the initiative. And in the objectives of the initiative, foresight comes into play in aligning the objectives of the initiatives with the wider and longer term objectives of the Commission. So it is clear that any initiative has to be able to explain how it aligns with the objectives of the Commission. And of course, Foresight plays a role, as some of the objectives of the Commissions are longer term, are wider, and require many policies and many initiatives to be implemented. Once we determine the problem and the objectives, we have to look at the situation as it is. What happens if we continue as we are? This is the so-called baseline. And baseline is supposed to be dynamic assessment. We have to look at the baseline as it is today, but it will plausibly be tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And this is something we emphasize when we talk about baselines. It is important that the baseline is not a snapshot of today. The snapshot of today lasts only for today. That dynamic evolution of the baseline needs to be included. It's actually an important parameter of the definition of the baseline. And once we have defined the baseline, then we have to look at the options for the initiative. What are the options? What could we do? And the options, then that's where the real assessment of impact comes in. The impact of the options has to be assessed. So we see that Foresight comes in two places here. In the definition of the options themselves, they have to be chosen with a certain degree of plausibility, with a certain degree of realism, with a certain degree of applicability and feasibility. So the definition of the options, and then when we come to the potential impact, it is very important to be able to assess all equally plausible impacts. And to determine that there is a variety of plausible impacts, of course, we have to have a good idea of what might happen, and Foresight then comes into play here as well. And in fact, once we get to the definition of the option and the assessment of impacts, that is, let's say, the arc of the impact assessment. And this is where the steps, and as you can see practically at every step, Foresight can be extremely relevant. Now, as I indicated, we use Foresight also for evaluations. And for one particular aspect of evaluations, which I'm sure you will address tomorrow, which is the relevance of the intervention. If we look back at what we've done, we want to know that what we've done was relevant at the time, but also whether it might be relevant in the future. So this is a specific aspect which is worth discussing. Perhaps you will look at it more in depth tomorrow. Now, what are general principles that we use and that are very clearly indicated in our toolbox? General principles for the use of Foresight are essentially two: flexibility and proportionality. Flexibility because our toolbox does not envisage only one kind of Foresight methodology. So there are two that are mentioned. One is scenarios, one is megatrends, but it is very clear that others can be used if appropriate, if better suited. So this flexibility is important because, as you've heard, Foresight has been systematized and has been formalized as one of the main and the key dimensions of better regulation relatively recent in 2021. So this is something that we are still applying, that we are still learning about. And this flexibility is important, and in practice it is very important to have, given the wide variety of initiatives that of course go through the impacts assessment and the better regulation coming from the Commission. Now the second principle is proportionality. Why is it important to have proportionality? Well, not all initiatives need to have the same degree of Foresight analysis, because not all the same initiatives have the same degree of projection in the future, for example. Not all of them require any specific definition of different scenarios, because there is not a wide variety of scenarios, or maybe there are smaller initiatives. There are a number of reasons for which foresight might not be that may be treated proportionally, and it has to be mentioned. It has to be included in the impact assessment. But proportionality is a general principle of impact assessment in any case, but it is specifically mentioned for foresight because it is clear that there is a variety of initiatives and a variety of the necessity to look into the future, whether it is in the near future or in the far future. Now, as I said, this new tool has been formalized in 2021, which means that the first year in which it was really used in a very formalized and a very systematized way was 2022. And that's where we made some comments as RSP. We made some comments in an annual report on foresight, where we were able to say that we saw an improvement in the use of foresight in the various impact assessments during the year 2022. In particular, we have, on the basis of our statistics, which I invite you to look at, we have indicated that about half, almost half, of all those impact assessments for which foresight was relevant have actually used it and used it to a sufficient degree. And please understand that these statistics, they refer to draft impact assessments as they come to the regulatory scrutiny board. Those impact assessments are, in most cases, significantly improved after they leave, so to speak, our tender and loving care in the RSP. And therefore, these statistics need to be clearly referred to draft impact assessments that we see for the quality check. Now, what is interesting also is that out of around 70 impact assessments, we consider that about 39 were relevant for foresight, but a high number of 31 were not actually so relevant for foresight, which gives you the idea that there is quite a variety, as I said, of initiatives, big and small, and therefore it is very important to maintain the flexibility and the proportionality. We did notice, for example, that there was a huge improvement in using foresight for the problem evolution. As I mentioned, very, very important, the first step that we do, the problem. But also the baseline, the notion that the baseline has to be dynamic, it cannot be static, is also something that we've seen an improvement in. And we've also seen an improvement, I have to say, in evaluations, which is going to be very important. It's important for this year and it's important for next year because evaluations are now coming to the fore, because obviously it's now time to look at what we've done in the policy cycle. Voilà. So these are just the main, let's say, steps that we undertake to include foresight in the better regulation and the work that we do, of course, as regulatory scrutiny board to include it in our quality checklist. Voilà. So I would stop here, and I'm sure I will listen with great interest to our next speakers, and hope to have a very good discussion in this point. Thank you, Zoltan.
I thank you for this. For this interesting insight behind the scenes of the RSP, and especially how you look at foresight. Before handing it over to my colleagues who will actually continue, there is a nice flow actually between the interventions, you will see. They will continue with analyzing the foresight in impact assessments, but I would have a question which also came to my mind when I was reading different papers. Now that you have an experience with impact assessments containing or not containing foresight for the last years, do you plan to come up with some kind of best practices or guidance for the services on because it's still a new thing, and I don't know how, maybe the colleagues will tell us about, but how foresight is applied across the departments in the Commission and whether such guidelines would be useful.
Thank you. I think guidance are always useful. They would not come from us. They would come from the services of the Commission, in particular the Secretary General. And I'm pretty sure they're already working with colleagues in order to make sure that foresight is even more included. It's not really something we would do, but I'm pretty sure that they're already working on it. And also, I have to say that improvements are visible all the time. So I think we're going in the right direction.
Well, then, this will be probably confirmed by the colleagues, so I hand it over to Suzana and Irmi.
Good afternoon to our audience here in the room and online. Thank you, Zoltan, for giving me the floor. A lot of ground has already been covered by the previous panel, but also by the previous speaker, Ms. SIRACUSA. So I would like to build on what has already been mentioned and move one step forward. My intervention is based on the findings of the research that we have conducted in EPRS on the use of strategic foresight in Commission impact assessments. And I will not bother you with the figures. You may find the figures in the briefing, which is available here at the entry of the room, or a briefing that you can consult online, or I'm told that at a certain moment you will see on the screen the title of the briefing appearing with a QR code, so you can scan the QR code. Let me begin by outlining that there has been, and I confirm through our research, measurable progress in the use the Commission has made of strategic foresight in its impact assessments for the period 2020 to 2023. So we have looked at the 2 years prior and the 2 years since the 1st of January 2022. And as Ms. SIRACUSA has mentioned, 2022 is a year where the amended EU Better Regulation guidelines and toolbox started to apply. So 2 years before, 2 years after, that allowed us to compare. And progress entailed an increase in the number of impact assessments mentioning foresight. Second, it entailed an increase in the number of impact assessments which have benefited of dedicated supporting foresight studies conducted either by the Joint Research Center or by external contractors based on foresight methodology. And I would argue that this is a good practice the Commission could further develop in the years to come. But we have all to be aware that this going into defining and conducting dedicated studies requires time, requires resources, and requires expertise. And if I come back to a third point where we have identified progress whilst conducting our research, I would argue that progress was visible in increasing compliance with the requirements of the EU Better Regulation guidelines and toolbox, and here I speak under the control of Ms. SIRACUSA, with the regulatory scrutiny board opinions. So let me illustrate this point by giving you an example. Ms. SIRACUSA already has mentioned the problem definition, the policy options. So whilst examining the different impact assessments for the past 4 years, we have observed that at the beginning of the examined period, there was rarely mentioning of strategic foresight within the problem definition, but it was mentioned somewhere else, possibly in the impact assessment report. And we have seen that in compliance with the requirement of the EU Better Regulation Toolbox and guidelines, progressively the impact assessment started to mention strategic foresight in the problem definition, and not only in the problem definition, but also in the policy options and in the annexes. So to a certain extent, this reflects compliance as well as consistency. It might be, because Zoltan, you were talking about best practices, it might be a best practice that could be carried forward in the years to come. But yet there is also room for improvement. As practices remain diverse within and across the European Commission, different directorate generals which are conducting impact assessments, which may also be the result of the diversity of the topics on which the Commission is called to propose legislation. But that does not necessarily explain it all, I would argue. And I'll come back to this point on diversity later in my presentation. Now, let me outline for you the three questions which I wish to cover. First, why use strategic foresight in impact assessments? The second question, and here my question is, what use of strategic foresight? Ms. SIRACUSA, you already consider how to use strategic foresight. I think there are some synergies there. And the third question is, what are the challenges ahead? So when it comes to the first question, why use strategic foresight in impact assessment? The easy answer would be because the amended EU Better Regulation Guidelines and Toolbox call for it. But this is, to a certain extent, a fast way to reducing strategic foresight to just a tick box exercise. And it seems to me that the integration of strategic foresight into EU Better Regulation framework needs to be seen more as an opportunity, rather than yet an additional administrative burden. A pathway to more resilient EU policies and legislation, and we have heard a lot in the previous panel on resilience of future-proofing legislation, future-proofing policies. And I would suggest at this point that we take a step back and we consider that nearly 30 years ago, Bill Gates said, and some of you may know this quote, that, and I quote, "We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10, end of quote. So we could reflect on how the world has transformed during the past 30 years, how it looked 20 years ago, 10 years ago, as well as on our current realities. And possibly we could also reflect on the fact that for long, foresight played a minimal role in the way we in Europe shaped policies, making us more vulnerable and less aware of the change to come. So strategic foresight is key to help us anticipate change and have a reasonable estimation of its impacts on the short and long term. It allows to explore alternative pathways and to inform decision making. It allows to focus on the medium to long term, on the next 5 to 10, even 15 years. And this is exactly where the time span is key for our legislation. We have heard in the earlier panel, that it takes us nearly 2 years to agree on a piece of legislation, and on average, and that we start to review it between 3 to 6 years after. So we are more or less in that 10 years span where foresight is key for us to anticipate. But to be clear, and here I'm joining what you have mentioned in terms of flexibility and proportionality, it might be that not every topic on which the Commission is to propose legislation is suitable for or should require the use of strategic foresight. And this is where I'm going to my second question: what use of strategic foresight in impact assessment? So it is important to use, I would argue, strategic foresight in impact assessments when it adds value, namely in those cases where the topic is one which has a long-term dimension. And we can think about climate, we can think about energy, we can think about the economy, for instance. And the better regulation tool, as we have heard from Ms. SIRACUSA, is offering the flexibility to the European Commission to conduct this on a flexible way. But in fact, I would say that the Commission has also a rather discretionary power, as it is not bound to explain why and when it chooses not to use foresight. And here, a change of practice would add to transparency. In the briefing, you are going to see that there is one case and only one case of an impact assessment where the Commission is saying why foresight is not fit for that particular topic. It can be a start of a practice for similar topics where foresight would not necessarily bring an answer. Ms. SIRACUSA, you have already mentioned the methods, the scenarios, and the megatrends, so I will not spend time on this. Maybe we can have a discussion during the questions and answers. But I would want to underline that my colleague Irmi will present a case study, the impact assessment on critical raw materials, which was informed by foresight studies. Yes. I will not say more. So this brings me to the second question, the third question, which I have outlined. What are the challenges ahead? And when preparing, I thought, well, there are two challenges that I would like to mention. One is coordination, and the other one is resources and expertise. And I'm very, very happy that Steve Quest in the earlier panel has mentioned coordination as one of the elements on which the Commission services need to work on, because that gives me the possibility not to go in depth into that point, but yes, coordination might be a challenge ahead. And then resources and expertise, because there are different choices and there are different implications in the case the Commission wishes to produce more in-house supporting foresight studies in terms of resources and expertise, or to outsource that. I will stop here on the challenges, and I would like to conclude by stressing that the existing practices, some of the good practices which already we saw developing in the last years, should be continued. And they could lead to more consistency and more transparency in the use of foresight by the Commission. And also a more systematic use of strategic foresight in policy making would allow us in Europe to be better prepared for and to anticipate the change to come. I will maybe stop here. I will be happy to take questions, and I will pass the floor now, if you allow, Zoltan, to Irmi.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I would just like to ask Zoltan, how many minutes do I have for the case study? Is 5 minutes too much? Can we afford that? Okay. So I would like to build on what has been said by Mrs. SIRACUSA from the RSB and by my colleague Suzana. I would like to complement that with practical example, with a concrete example of a Commission impact assessment that was informed or even shaped by strategic foresight thinking. And this is the impact assessment that supported the Commission proposal for a European Critical Raw Materials Act. It was published in March 2023. As you may know, the European Parliament's Ex-Ante Impact Assessment Unit, this is the unit I work in, so we routinely appraise Commission impact assessments for their quality, and this is meant to support the committee deliberations here in the House. I had the pleasure of, I only joined the unit a year ago. My first file was actually this one. So I published a briefing on my analysis of the Commission impact assessment. What are critical raw materials? Well, these materials, such as lithium, cobalt, or silicon metal, they concern our everyday lives. They're essential for a whole lot of technologies and appliances, including electric cars, smartphones, semiconductors, or solar panels, many, many more. In fact, Europe's green and digital transition relies very heavily on the supply of critical raw materials. And therefore, their supply, but also their processing are key, also in the context of the EU's strategic autonomy. While the need for critical raw materials is already enormous today, the future projections suggest that the need will literally skyrocket. So this was just a bit of contextualization to show you that there is indeed, without any doubt, a future-oriented dimension in the proposed Critical Raw Materials Act. I would now like to spend the next 3 minutes to discuss how the Commission used foresight in this impact assessment to prove the draft Act. And I will briefly comment on 3 specific issues, namely megatrends, foresight studies, and stress testing. Suzana just mentioned that, and also Mrs. SIRACUSA just mentioned that one of the main foresight tools set out in the better regulation guidelines and toolbox are megatrends. The Commission's Joint Research Service, the JRC, defined megatrends as, and I'm quoting here, long-term driving forces that are observable now and will most likely continue to have a significant impact in the future. So the JRC has identified 14 such megatrends in the past that are relevant for the future of Europe. And when we look into the impact assessment on critical raw materials, at first glance, many of you might agree, and without deeper assessment, some of these 14 megatrends appear to be highly relevant to the topic of critical raw material supply. These are in particular the megatrends on aggravating resource scarcity, the description of which explicitly includes minerals, accelerating technological change and digitalization, the megatrend of a changing security paradigm, which may impact on the supply of critical raw materials, and also growing consumption, for instance. However, and I found this a bit surprising when I analyzed the impact assessment, it does not analyze or even mention megatrends. Though I must say some of the supporting studies do. And this brings me already to my second point I wanted to raise. The impact assessment draws, among other sources, on several foresight studies, so not one, but several. And if we think how time and resource intensive they are, that's remarkable. Carried out by the JRC and partly also by DG GROW between 2020 and 2023. These foresight studies explore the EU's future need of critical raw materials, and they also analyze the resilience of critical supply chains in key technologies. The studies provide forecasts based on various long-term scenarios. And interestingly, long-term in this impact assessment goes beyond what Suzana just mentioned. They mean here a time horizon up to 2050. So we really speak about longer-term thinking or even next generation thinking. And furthermore, the Foresight studies, they coined one of the key concepts of the draft act, namely strategic raw materials. The third and last point I wanted to highlight is that the impact assessment on critical raw materials is one of very few Commission impact assessments that consider the Foresight tool stress testing. And I mean outside the world of banking and finance. Actually, the proposed act requires to stress test the supply chain of each of the identified strategic raw materials in 3-year intervals. This should help to assess their vulnerability to supply disruptions. And these stress testing scenarios, this testing exercise would be based on scenarios. This brings me already to my conclusion. So I think the case of the impact assessment on critical raw materials, it clearly showed that integrating strategic foresight thinking into impact assessments has a great potential. It can add value to policy making in the sense of making policies more resilient and future-proof. This is relevant for policies with a longer-term dimension and policies that are prone to disruptions and shocks. And I might have disappointed you with my conclusion because it just mirrors what has been said before. Thank you for attention. I'm also very happy to take your questions afterwards.
Thanks to both of you for this. And I turn briefly to Elisabetta if you want to react or okay, good. Then I would, before going on to the next speakers, I would have just 2 short questions to Suzana and Irmi regarding what they said. To Suzana is like, did you, I mean, when you were drafting this paper, did you identify practices that the Commission could use to deepen, could deepen in order to strengthen the foresight, strategic foresight dimension in impact assessments?
Well, I've already mentioned a number of practices which I think that the Commission could, one of these practices is also when there is no need for foresight. Mention it. That shows that you thought it through why foresight would not be adapted to that particular impact assessment. But I think that there is also a possibility to move a little bit forward in terms of the use of scenarios. But that would require more studies which are going to be those which are supporting the impact assessment. But in order to have more foresight studies in support of an impact assessment, or we have also seen, and as the example that Irmi has mentioned on critical raw materials is a good example because you have 2 different studies supporting the same impact assessment. You can have also a study supporting several impact assessments, as we saw in the climate policies. But for these studies, you need to have a why, a rationale. So the topic has to be a topic which is fit for foresight, which takes into consideration the long term, 2040, for example. And we have to be aware that this is time consuming. You need to have the time before the impact assessment to carry the foresight study. So that adds to the entire process.
Thank you. And Irmi, my question to you will be brief, and it's more based on my curiosity. You spoke about stress testing, which will be the subject of our next intervention. And I first heard about stress testing after the financial crisis, and it was done to the financial market and banks. And it was interesting that you brought an example which is not from that area, critical raw materials. Did you, through your analysis of impact assessments or evaluations, did you come across any other examples where stress testing was used, not in the typical sectors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. Interesting. I must confess, not in the area of ex post evaluation, in which I worked until last year. But yes, I have come across 2 other cases, and I don't know whether this is a comprehensive account. Very recently, in the new climate targets that came out as a communication 2 weeks ago or so, the concept of stress testing appears, and I think I have also seen it in the emission trading system impact assessment, to be checked, but I'm pretty sure I saw it there.
Thank you, Irmi. Maybe we have an expert here who can confirm what you said. I will turn to Tine Andersen, who will speak about the secrets of stress testing as a tool for better regulation.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me here. It's very interesting, and it's very difficult not to reflect upon everything I've heard until now, but I'll go ahead with my presentation nevertheless. So I will show you a PowerPoint presentation because I'm a consultant, and that's what consultants do. So this is probably the only PowerPoint you'll see in this conference. I've already been introduced kindly by Zoltan, so I won't say any more about myself, but I'd like to say a little about why I'm talking about stress testing today. The company or research institute that I'm working in, Danish Technological Institute, were contracted by EPRS to do work on stress testing of policies. I can't even remember the date of the first contract. I think it was 21. Yeah, it was. We did 2 studies for them. And in a little while, I'll show you what we've done. But what I'm going to talk about is much more practical than what you've heard up until now. It's sort of getting your fingers into the mud, as it were, trying to look at real legislation and see how it performs in real life. So please, I've got the thingy here. Let's see how it will work. Yeah, I'm pressing. Yeah. So it's a specific instance of using foresight in the policy cycle. It's not foresight in the very broad sense, but rather in the quite narrow sense. And as has already been said, of course, is that one of the great revelations that spiraled foresight into policy was COVID and the lack of preparedness generally for COVID. And looking at how different countries and the EU did not perform as well as they could have in that situation. And then there was the inspiration from the financial sector, as has already been said also. Could something similar be done for legislation? And also there was this idea that foresight is heavy, it's big, it takes time, it takes experts, it takes resources. Could we do something lighter, something quicker, something more flexible? So the objectives that we had as a team working for EPRS was to give input to a European approach to policy stress testing. And of course, we started out by defining it because we found out that it hadn't been defined in 2021. In close dialogue with the EPRS, we defined policy stress testing as a foresight-based method to check if a policy action, and that would be a piece of legislation or an initiative or, any way, where, or any time in the policy cycle, if this policy was sufficiently robust, resilient and reactive to possible future shocks and challenges. And also, of course, identify avenues for policy action to reinforce the weak points of the policy action. So rather than dealing with megatrends or whole world scenarios, we are dealing here with shocks. And I'll tell you a bit more about shocks later on. But first, an overview of this research that we did between 21 and 23. The first thing we did was to find out if somebody somewhere did something like this. We looked at worldwide, basically, at foresight and policy to see whether there was any inspiration to be got. And then after doing that, we went on to develop a methodology for stress testing, pilot testing it on 3 EU policy fields, refining the methodology, and here we are into the second study. And then we did the pilot test, which is the bulk of the second study, which was a test of EU rail transport policies. And then finally, of course, came up with lessons learned. And in the first part of the study, we didn't find very much going on. Of course, there is a foresight community, which we are very well aware of. And there are foresight going on, but stress testing, not really. But there were some interesting lessons to be learned anyway. And we heard already about Finland, which is in the middle of my picture there. So I won't tell you more about that. But we found also it was interesting to look at the UK experience. They provide foresight as a service. It's very much in the vein of the UK to not have foresight as an obligation, but have it as a service provided by an organization which is in the Government Office for Science. They provide some interesting tools to politicians. They provide a futures toolkit and a trend deck, which is somewhat like the megatrends. And they provide also foresight reports on specific issues. But there are no legal obligations to use foresight in the UK. The other country that we found, except for Finland, would be interesting to look at is the Netherlands. They have a very narrow use of foresight because it's basically, it has to do with water, which is not very surprising given that most of Netherlands is below the water table. So they have since sometime in the 50s, I think they had a large disaster with many people killed in a flood. And since then they have operated a program which is actually conducting stress tests, but with respect to climate change and in particular water. So all authorities at all levels are obliged to conduct stress tests and in buildings, roads, infrastructure, health, everywhere, but related to climate risk. That was interesting as well. Then the phases in the stress testing that we devised are roughly as follows. we started scoping the exercise, looking at which legislation should be stress tested. And then we evaluated vulnerabilities as we saw it from the outset in that legislation. Where would that legislation be vulnerable and to what? And of course, we did this in a close dialogue with EPRS, who knew the legislation and legal experts and so on. And then from this, it was a very back and forward process. From this scoping, we developed scenarios of shocks that could conceivably threaten the legislation. And after having identified these shocks, we carried out the proper stress test, which was going through the legislation and considering the performance. If this horrible shock should take place, how would this legislation or this initiative perform? So in practice, we decided to focus on 3 flagship initiatives in the Smart and Sustainable Mobility Strategy, and those were greening freight transport, making connected and automated multimodal mobility a reality, and reinforcing the single market. And within those flagship initiatives, we identified concrete legislation to test. Then we identified the shocks that could challenge those policies. And that was a bottom-up process where we talked to sector experts, transport experts, rail experts, about where they saw vulnerabilities in the policies. After that, we mapped out the impact of the shocks, and again, we had workshops with EPRS staff and sector experts to validate our mapping of impacts. And on that basis, we developed 4 narrative scenarios for testing these policies. And then the scenarios were called as follows: persistent heat wave affecting most of Europe. EU bans new internal combustion engine heavy goods vehicles as of 2035. Destructive cyber attack targeting ERMTS, that's the automated rail signal system. And China invades Taiwan. That were our 4 scenarios, and we ran those scenarios on the legislation. The workshops we conducted took as a point of departure impact maps like this one, and you can't read what's in it, doesn't matter. What matters is that we tried to map out the impact, and then we discussed with the experts, can you see this? I mean, is it, maybe you don't think it's very plausible, but is it totally stupid? And since we didn't rely on one expert, but quite some, this is not exact science, is what I'm trying to say. And Foresight, don't let anybody get you into believing that Foresight is exact science, because it's not. It's, as somebody also said, it's a mindset very much. It's the ability to see that there are different futures and that we might even shape it ourselves. So, oh, I'm going back here. That's not. The stress test. So what we were going through, reading through the legislation, and in each scenario asking the legislation, could the policy goals be reached in this scenario? What about the assumptions? Would they hold? And are there other policies in place? That was one of the difficult parts, and we had great help of EPRS there, because all of a sudden we had to look at other policies than rail policy. But in some cases, there were actually other policies in place that would alleviate some negative outcomes. And the findings are presented in the reports like this. This is the one about the destructive cyber attack targeting the signaling system, the automated signaling system. And the box at the bottom shows the legislation that we stress tested, and for each piece of legislation there is a traffic light. And in this case, all of them were yellow. I'm happy to say that we actually had some green cases in the other scenarios, but we also had a red one. So we did actually manage to uncover some vulnerabilities. The lessons learned from this is that this methodology has proven effective in identifying vulnerabilities in policies and legislation. And we found that all of the time we had difficulty distinguishing between the policies and the infrastructure itself, because this is an area where the infrastructure is quite tangible, I would say. So that the stress test pointed us towards a need for instruments to ensure the continuous functioning of the rail network during crisis situations. So that's really more in the fire brigade department than in the futuristic department. Also, and this is in line with something that has been said already. It doesn't make sense to look just at one single policy in isolation. This stress test really underlined the need to consider the development in other spheres than just the rail transport or even just the transport sector, because the developments here depend so much on what goes on in digitalization and in energy policies, to mention the most obvious, so that this silo approach is not really useful. Also, in line with what has been said already, it's neither desirable nor possible to stress test all EU policies or all national policies for that matter. It should be considered where it can offer higher added value to the existing lawmaking processes. And finally, what I think is a very important point is that a key element in this exercise was the involvement of not only policymakers, but to a large extent also stakeholders. And not only Foresight experts, but people from the real rail sector and national policymakers in the sector. Their involvement was really important in carrying out this exercise. And now I'm so lucky that I have my contractor sitting in the audience. So I would ask Mina if you've got something to add or if you're happy with my presentation. Or Lauro.
Thank you very much. Lauro Panella, we started this process, as I said, on stress testing A couple of years ago, we had the chance to work with Tine ANDERSEN and to have 2 studies with her. And the idea was, as she explained, very simple. Foresight is what we think for the future, megatrends and so on. The point is to stress this legislation, and this is stress testing, so to see if the current legislation foresees what could be big-scale scenario adverse event. For example, in the case of Stability and Growth Pact regulation, there is an article say, in the case of severe downturn, the pact could be suspended. So there is an article which say what to do in the case of serious adverse event. Now the question was, when we started the analysis, in the case of digital legislation, there is an article able to say to operators, public and private, what to do in the case of collapse of internet. And the idea was to stress the legislation. This is stress testing, to understand if the legislation has articles telling what to do. And if not, to cover the gaps and be in line what was foreseen by the Foresight activity. This was the project, and Tine has explained very well. Thank you very much.
I have 2 questions regarding stress testing. I'm very curious who develops the shock scenarios? Because you said policymakers and stakeholders are involved. Is it more the policymakers, the stakeholders? It goes by hand in hand. Is it fantasy writers or just reality? I mean, I'm curious really to see, because there are so many things that can come up from one day to another, and you somehow have to predict a shock which may or may not happen.
Well, the first and easy answer is all of them. and then maybe not so easy answer is it requires a certain amount of, well, I'm not happy about the science fiction part, but imagination, I would say, is a quality, and it's a quality which enters into a concept which was mentioned earlier today, which is futures literacy. Futures literacy is about accepting that tomorrow may not be as today, and it may even be quite surprising. This is one thing, to accept that, and also to imagine that very strange things can actually happen within 10 years. And we may see some signs out there already, and that has been mentioned also. The horizon scanning, looking for weak signs of things to come. This is a part of futures literacy, being able to interpret the weak signs in the world around us.
We have 3 minutes for questions. So, yes, the gentleman over there.
Well, thank you. I'm Giovanni Rizzoni of the Italian Chamber of Deputies Research Service. Well, I have a question for all the participants to the panel, and this is the question. There is a joke about the economists. The economists are the people who are studying the reasons why their predictions didn't come true. This is the joke about the economists. And in order to avoid the same joke for the foresight, I think that, and this is the question, do you think that the foresight should be combined with the hindsight? What do I mean? What we were confronted with shocks and very unpredictable events. The economic crisis, COVID crisis, Russian aggression, and so on. These events were unexpected, but because they were unexpected, they were very rich in fresh information about the world, the society, and so on. How we can make the most of what already happened in order to forecast, to prepare our foresight for the future. This is the question.
I'm very happy for that question. I think it's a very interesting question, but I also think that you are wrong, because these events that you mentioned were not unexpected. But you're right in saying we should study hindsight. But these events were expected by specialists. There were lots of people who foresaw the financial crisis. There were lots of epidemiologists, virologists, and other good people who foresaw a pandemic. But there were no one listening to them. That was the problem. Not that the knowledge wasn't there, but that it hadn't been taken up by people who could actually act and react to them in time. So when they were brought to the attention of policymakers, they were unexpected by the policymakers, but not by the people with insight into the bank sector or with insight into pandemics.
Thank you. As this question, I think, triggered maybe other panelists, I would, yes, I don't know, Elisabetta or...
Well, I will complement what has been already answered before, because, yes, I join my fellow panelists in saying that I think you are wrong when you are saying that there were not helpful strategic foresight analysis that have anticipated a number of shocks through which we have went through recently. And one of these shocks is the one of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And there were studies, we also examined in EPRS this question before the war has started, but there were studies which were anticipating. We heard also the member of the Finnish parliament say that the Finnish parliament was examining the more assertive behavior of Russia. And this has, I would say, also created to a certain extent a little bit of disunity also within the EU after 2014, because there were more of some hoax in terms of how they have seen the assertiveness of Russia, and you can see Poland in that case, and then others who were not thinking about a change of behavior of Russia, and that to a certain extent a number of countries on the eastern flank have anticipated that.
Thank you. I'm looking at the watch, and I think it's time to make my most popular announcement for the day, which is that, well, if you have questions, I understand from online audience we don't have anything, but you will have plenty of opportunities to approach us by email or in reaction to the video which will be published on YouTube, I understand. So I would like to extend the invitation to all of you to a reception which is held on the ground floor of this building in the members' restaurant I don't say the full name because it's not very inspirational. It's on the 0th floor, and my colleagues will help you there. So please follow them. Thank you very much for your attention.